If you were a sailor in the early 1700s, sailing the warm waters of the Caribbean or along the coast of the American colonies, there was one name that could make an entire ship's crew go completely silent. Not a sea monster, not a storm, not even the Royal Navy. Blackbeard. His real name was Edward Teach, though some records spell it Thatch, because nobody in the 1700s could agree on how to spell anything. He was born in England, probably around 1680, and by the time he was in his 30s, he had become the most feared pirate in the Atlantic world, which, when you think about it, is quite a career arc. But before we get to the terror and the treasure and the truly spectacular beard, let's set the scene. Because the world Blackbeard sailed into was one that had basically accidentally created the perfect conditions for piracy, and then acted completely surprised when pirates showed up. The early 1700s were a strange moment in history. Wars between European powers had been going on for decades, and during wartime, governments would hire private sailors called privateers to attack enemy ships. These privateers were basically government-approved pirates, and they got a piece of paper called a letter of marque that said it was totally legal to rob ships, as long as they were the right ships. Then the wars ended, and suddenly thousands of skilled sailors who had spent years attacking and looting vessels found themselves unemployed. The governments that had hired them said, essentially, "Thanks for the help. Best of luck. Please stop robbing ships now." Many of them did not stop robbing ships. This period, roughly from the 1690s to the 1730s, became known as the Golden Age of Piracy. The Caribbean was a busy, wealthy, and relatively lawless stretch of ocean, full of merchant ships carrying sugar, tobacco, rum, and silver. For an experienced sailor with few other options and very few qualms, it was an extremely target-rich environment. And Edward Teach, soon to be Blackbeard, was about to become its biggest star. Teach started out working under a pirate captain named Benjamin Hornigold, which sounds like a character from a children's book, but was a very real and very dangerous man. Under Hornigold, Teach learned the trade, how to read weather and tides, how to overtake a vessel, how to negotiate or not negotiate with captured crews. He was a quick learner. He was also, by all accounts, enormous, tall, broad-shouldered, and physically intimidating in a way that made people deeply uncomfortable even before he did anything threatening. Then came the beard. Edward Teach had a thick, long, jet-black beard that he grew out and braided into sections. Before battle, he would weave slow-burning fuses into the braids and light them. So when he appeared on deck in the smoke and chaos of a fight, he looked like a man whose face was literally on fire. Was this tactically necessary? Absolutely not. Was it one of the most effective pieces of personal branding in human history? 100% yes. Teach understood something that most people in any era struggle to grasp. Sometimes the scariest thing you can do is make people believe you are scarier than you actually are. Blackbeard didn't want to fight. Fighting was dangerous, ships got damaged, crew members got hurt, and the whole operation became expensive and complicated. What Blackbeard wanted was for other ships to look at him, beard on fire, eyes wild, standing at the front of his vessel with an arsenal of pistols and swords strapped to his chest, and immediately decide that surrendering was the better option. It worked. Remarkably often, it worked. Eyewitness accounts from sailors who were captured by Blackbeard described the experience in almost identical terms. The black flag going up, the smoke, the shouting, the overwhelming sense that resistance was not just futile, but actively unwise. Most ships handed over their cargo without a single shot being fired. Blackbeard had essentially turned fear itself into a business strategy. By 1717, Blackbeard had his own ship. He captured a large French vessel, outfitted it with 40 cannons, and renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge. 40 cannons, for reference. A well-armed naval warship of the era might carry 60 to 80 guns, so Blackbeard was operating at nearly naval warship level, just without any government telling him what to do with it. He sailed the Caribbean and the American coast with a fleet of ships and a crew of several hundred men, some willing pirates, some captured sailors who had been offered a choice between joining and a much less pleasant alternative. His base of operations was often around the Bahamas and the Carolinas, where corrupt local officials were sometimes willing to look the other way in exchange for a share of the loot. The ports and taverns of the Caribbean were full of pirates during this era, and most of them had a code, a set of rules that the crew agreed to before setting sail. These pirate codes covered everything from how plunder would be divided to what happened if someone started a fight with a crewmate on board. Punishments were spelled out clearly. Shares were assigned by role. Disputes could be brought before the crew for a vote. It was, in many ways, a more transparent system of governance than most of the colonies these pirates were operating next to. Pirates, it turns out, were running some of the most egalitarian organizations of the 18th century, which is either inspiring or deeply ironic, depending on how you feel about theft. In 1718, Blackbeard pulled off one of the boldest moves of his career. He blockaded the entire port of Charleston, South Carolina, one of the most important ports in colonial America, with his fleet. He held ships hostage, refused to let anyone in or out, and sent a ransom demand to the city, send him a chest of medicine, or he would start sending back the heads of his hostages. Charleston paid. A pirate had just held an American city hostage and won. Entirely through the power of reputation, a fleet of ships, and the very credible impression that he was completely out of his mind. He was not, for the record, actually out of his mind. Accounts from people who met Blackbeard in less threatening circumstances described him as intelligent, charismatic, and surprisingly reasonable when he wasn't actively terrifying people. He reportedly treated his crew well, shared plunder fairly, and by several accounts was well-read and could hold a genuine conversation about navigation, history, and politics. The monster of the seas was, in private, apparently quite good company. But the golden age couldn't last forever. Britain was losing too much trade to piracy, and in 1718 the government cracked down hard. A royal pardon was offered to any pirate who surrendered, and many took it, including Blackbeard, who accepted a pardon from the governor of North Carolina. He then immediately went back to piracy, almost right away. He had been retired for approximately 5 minutes before he decided that honest living wasn't really his thing. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, had had enough. He organized a military expedition, and without even telling the North Carolina governor, partly because he suspected that governor of being on Blackbeard's payroll, and sent 2 small naval vessels under the command of a young lieutenant named Robert Maynard to hunt Blackbeard down. They found him anchored near Ocracoke Island, off the coast of North Carolina, on the evening of November 21st, 1718. Blackbeard and his crew were celebrating. There had been a party. The timing was either very bad luck or very good intelligence, depending on which side you were on. The battle the next morning was one of the most dramatic in the history of piracy. Blackbeard's crew used grenades, bottles filled with shot and gunpowder, to clear Maynard's deck. Maynard ordered most of his men below, making his ship look nearly abandoned. Blackbeard, thinking the fight was almost over, brought his men aboard to finish it. Then Maynard's crew came up from below. The fighting was brutal and close. Blackbeard took 5 bullet wounds and more than 20 sword cuts during the battle, and reportedly kept fighting through all of it. He was finally stopped only when a sword cut opened his neck. He collapsed and died still on his feet, or close to it, which was exactly the kind of ending that legends are made of. Maynard had Blackbeard's head cut off and hung from the front of his ship as proof of the kill. Grim? Yes. A completely normal thing to do in 1718? Also yes. Blackbeard was dead at around 38 years old. He had been a working pirate for only about 2 years. 2 years. In 2 years, he had captured dozens of ships, blockaded a colonial city, built a fleet, terrified the Atlantic world, and become the most famous pirate who ever lived. He is still the most famous pirate who ever lived. There were other pirates in the Golden Age who were more successful by the numbers. More ships captured, more treasure taken, longer careers. Bartholomew Roberts, for example, captured over 400 ships during his career, which makes Blackbeard look almost moderate by comparison. But nobody remembers Bartholomew Roberts the way they remember Blackbeard. None of them had his flair. None of them understood quite so perfectly that what people fear, they remember, and what they remember, they tell stories about. The wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge was discovered off the coast of North Carolina in 1996, nearly 300 years after it sank. Archaeologists have been carefully excavating it ever since, pulling up cannons, anchors, navigational instruments, and personal belongings from the ocean floor. Each object is a small piece of a world that vanished centuries ago, a world of open water, black flags, and one man with a burning beard who decided that if the world was going to fear him, he was going to make absolutely sure it had a good reason. We are still telling his story, 300 years later. Not bad for a man whose greatest weapon was a beard full of lit fuses and the unshakable confidence that everyone around him was about to have a very bad day.